Well, good evening and welcome everybody on behalf of the British Institute at Ankara to this evening's lecture. This is our annual spring lecture, and as usual, I think we've scheduled an ancient world lecture for this particular time of the year. Before I introduce the speaker, and in case I forget to say such things after the lecture, I thought I would say that after the lecture, I think we'll have a short question and answer session if the speaker is happy to do that. She is. And then there will be a reception out here on the landing. And I hope that as many of you as possible will be able to stay for a drink and to talk to us and to one another. There's a certain amount of literature relating to the British Institute available for you, and I hope that if you haven't received it or had access to it before you pick up a copy, I'm going to do a little bit of publicity that our next event in the autumn will not be the one-off lecture that we normally run in October, but a whole day. It's the Alan Hall Memorial event, when there's a cocktail of 5 lectures and various other forms of amusement, entertainment, instruction, and we want as many of you as possible to come. Most of you, I think, will have received some notice of this online via email contact, but there are flyers about it outside, so do pick one up and stick it in your diary. And also there are copies of the Institute's current newsletter and of something which we're extremely proud, which is the publication of David French's work on the milestones of Asia Minor, which now, I gather, this very day has achieved stage 7 in milestone 7, as it were, on the road to some sort of immortality. And there's a flyer for that as well, for those who are interested in such matters. So, enough of distractions from the main business of the evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Naoise Sweeney from the University of Leicester. Naoise did her PhD in Cambridge, I think, and her work has been especially on this sort of chronological interface between the end of prehistory and the beginning of history in Anatolia, the sort of Greeks before the Greeks, and the coming of historical Greek culture to Anatolia, but embedded in an understanding of late Anatolian prehistory. And she's taking us right to the center of that subject area with her lecture this evening on the Ionian cities, myth, migration, and the origins of Greek settlement in Anatolia. So, please.
Okay, can you hear me all right through this? Okay, thank you very, very much. First of all, no? Right, okay. Shall I? Is that better? Yes? Okay, right. So thank you very much to Stephen for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. And thank all of you for showing up. It's a lovely sunny afternoon, evening out there, and I know there are nicer places to be at this particular time, so I really appreciate you coming here for this lecture. And I hope that it will be worth the while. And even if it's not, there's a drink afterwards, so at least there's some compensation. So I have to admit that I wasn't completely sure, when I was preparing this lecture, quite how to pitch it. Whether it should be more of an academic research paper or whether this was going to be more of a kind of a public engagement lecture, so I wasn't quite sure at what level I should be kind of discussing things. So I've gone for a kind of medium way, and I look around them and I realise there are people who will find some parts of this incredibly basic, so I apologise for that. But if there's anything which you would like to know more about or hear me chat about in more detail, please do ask at the end or call me afterwards. That's absolutely fine. And I apologise again for the bits for starting off slowly. So starting off slowly, I'd just like to introduce the Ionian cities, the subject of this talk today. So the Ionian cities are, as we have on the map, we have 12 of them canonically, 13, Smyrna joins their number later on, but canonically there are 12 of them, the Dodecapolis, running from north to south, from Phocaea in the north to Miletus in the south. They're on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, of Asia Minor. Most of them are hugging on the coast. Colophon is the only inland city amongst these, and then there are 2 island cities of Chios and Samos as well. Now, as you'll see kind of geographically, the cities are clustered not just along the coastline, but around the mouths of these 3 large east-west river valleys. So you've got the Hermos, the Caister, and the Meander going in. And this is very much the geography of where the Ionian cities are, at the kind of intersection of these inland east-west trade routes along the river channels and on the coast is absolutely crucial for the story which I'm going to tell over the next 40 minutes or so, or 39 minutes now. They're not the only Greek settlements in Asia Minor. To the north of the Ionian cities, you have the Aeolian cities, which are ethnically distinct. They are ethnically Aeolian rather than ethnically Ionian. I haven't put them on the map, so just not to complicate stuff. And to the south of the Ionian cities, you have the Dorian cities. Greek again, but a slightly different flavour of Greek, as it were. Now, these Ionian cities are particularly exciting for a number of reasons. I find them absolutely thrilling, obviously. But they are a crucially kind of overlooked part of the Greek world for many kind of reasons. They contributed a lot to what we think of as typical Greek culture. They are the location for enormous amounts of literary innovation from Homer onwards, lyric poetry, Minermus, Xenophanes, Anacreon. A lot of the early Greek poets are located or originate from this part of the world. It's also the part of the world which kind of kicks off early Greek philosophy, the Milesian school of philosophy with Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes. This all begins in exactly here in Ionia. It's also the place where you get the emergence of the first very early Greek monumental temples, where we get the emergence of the Ionic order. Architectural innovation is absolutely part and parcel of what's going on here as well. Similarly, engineering innovation. This is the tunnel of Eupolinos and Samos. It's a water channel which is cut straight through the base of a mountain. Absolutely astounding stuff. Herodotus thought it was fantastic. Again, more scientific and engineering innovation in this region. And then, of course, in the visual arts as well. Ionia develops its own very distinctive form of sculptural styles in the Archaic period. This is the Genelos group from the Temple of Hera on Samos, and also in small decorative arts too. This is just an example of decorative art on a trefoil jar from Miletus. So just in sum, Ionia is an extremely culturally influential, especially in the Archaic period. It's an absolutely crucially important part of the Greek world, culturally speaking. It's also an crucially important part of the Greek world, economically speaking as well. In the Archaic period especially, it is a trading powerhouse. You get amphorae and objects made in Ionia which are circulating Mediterranean-wide, Black Sea-wide, and the Ionian cities are very proud of this trading power which they have. As you can see, the example of the Chian amphora on the coin from Chios as well. Just as well, I'm just kind of scooting through all this stuff as the general background. The Ionian cities are extremely active in the phenomenon which is Greek colonization around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea area. Here we have, just to illustrate, a map of the Greek colonies in red, Phoenician colonies in yellow. But if you look at it kind of numerically, I know there's no way you can read this, I'm very sorry. But if you look at it numerically, if you have 144 known Greek colonial cities, just under a third of these are colonized by the 12 or 13 cities of the Ionian League. That's an enormous amount. The Ionian cities are absolutely crucial and fundamental in the colonial activities. So what we have, therefore, is an incredibly important part of the Greek world, culturally, economically, and yet it is peripheral geographically. Now, I'm going to kind of qualify what I mean by this. So Ionia is sitting on the edge of the Anatolian landmass. It's certainly a part of Anatolia, and the Ionian cities are very closely integrated in with the Anatolian states, with Anatolian principalities, and with Anatolian culture on the ground as well. It's crucially engaged with the Near East, and it's very much part of the Near Eastern world, the Anatolian world. But it's also part of the Greek world too. So it partakes in both of these spheres almost equally. So we have this kind of interesting scenario with the Ionian cities. These are central to the Greek world, culturally, economically, yet kind of peripheral geographically. And it's interesting to try and see how we can square these two things. So the kind of question which emerges out of this is, how did the Greeks get to be here, right? What is the origin of these Ionian cities? Where do they come from? Where does this cultural and economic powerhouse come from? What kicks it all off? And that's what I'm going to try and answer, perhaps today. Now, what I'm going to do is divide this talk up into several sections. First of all, what I'm going to talk about is the traditional way of answering this question. What is the standard textbook answer to the question, how did the Greeks get here and what were they doing here anyway? Then what I'd like to do is take a step back and look at the evidence that this answer is based on, look through the archaeological evidence, look through the historical evidence, and look through the literary evidence, these three categories of evidence. Then I'm going to, towards the end of the paper, talk in a bit more detail about the literary evidence specifically, pick that apart and suggest a new way, a new approach that we could take to the literary evidence, which might bring us some new insights. And then finally, from that, I hope to propose, and hopefully you will all agree with me completely, a new, perhaps, explanation of how these Greek cities got to be here in the first place, based on this new approach. So, what is the standard textbook explanation for how the Greeks got to be in the first place? Now, the standard thing you'll read everywhere, or you'll have all probably know plenty about, is the story of the Ionian migration. This is the story of how Greeks from the western side of the Aegean, and especially from Athens, migrated from the west to the east of the Aegean and settled, led by Athenian noblemen sometimes. These are named people, princes of Athens. This is a story which we have in a number of different literary texts. In fact, in which we have in a vast number of different literary texts, and I'll come back to this later on in the talk. This is just one example of it. I've picked it not because it's particularly early or particularly reliable or anything, but because it's quite nice and short, and it gives us a nice summary of what the story is about. So this is Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, talking about the story of Neleus, the son of the king of Athens, Codrus. Now, Neleus wants to succeed his father to the throne of Athens, can't do it, so what he does is he takes a bunch of followers, crosses the sea, and founds his own kingdom over in Asia Minor. Fantastic story of daring do, excellent. And we get different versions of these stories in different texts, and then we get lots of kind of allusions to the story as well. A lot of the texts don't actually tell the whole story. They just make references to the story, or they touch upon it, or they touch upon certain characters. So we have this kind of textual body of information which gives us the main framework for this story, the main framework for the explanation. It's thought that this happens, the Ionian migration, happens sometime in the early Iron Age, or the Dark Age. We've just been talking about the Dark Age earlier. So this is a period where, on the borders of history and prehistory exactly, at the end of the Bronze Age, you've had the collapse of late Bronze Age states and empires. So at the end of the Bronze Age, we have a powerful Hittite empire based in central Anatolia. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, this basically implodes in on itself, fragments into lots of different units. To the west, you have the Mycenaean palace states. These are destroyed and burnt towards the end of the Bronze Age too, so that by the end of the Bronze Age, about 1200 BC, we have a situation where a lot of the complex political structures which were in the region have disappeared for one reason or another. I'm not going to go into the reasons behind this. We can discuss this later, but we don't really have time for now. What follows it we think, is the early Iron Age. Well, we know it's the early Iron Age, but what follows it, we think, is perhaps a dark age. Okay? Traditionally, this has been characterized as a time of barbarity and backwardness where we've lost literacy. There are no great palaces or monumental architectural structures built anymore. There's a reduction in the amount of trade. There's a reduction in wealth. That's the traditional story. Now, there's been a lot of revision of this traditional story because new evidence has shown that maybe the Dark Age is not quite as dark as we tended to think of it before. But we could still talk of the early Iron Age as a dark age in the sense that it's obscure. It's still obscure to us. There's not a huge amount of evidence for us to go on, so we are peering into the darkness when we're trying to discern what's going on in the early Iron Age. But it makes sense. If we're trying to place the story of the Ionian migration, it makes sense to place it in the early Iron Age. This is a time certainly of political instability, certainly of flexibility and fluidity. People are moving around. Placing the myth of the Ionian migration in this time kind of works, okay? And so people have presumed it's probably about the 11th century BC or so. But to come back to this whole question of evidence again, so this is the canonical explanation. This is how the Ionian cities come to existence because of the Ionian migration. This explanation comes, as I said, from the textual data, from the literary sources. But these aren't great sources of evidence. As I've said before, there are a lot of texts out there. Very few of them tell the story in its entirety. I put the Pausanias quote up because it's perhaps the easiest one to kind of catch snapshots at all. But a lot of the texts are much more fragmentary, much more difficult to work with. And what we've done as scholars is go back to all those texts and kind of build them together to create the story of the Ionian migration in a kind of comprehensible way. And what we've basically done is jigsaw the different texts together. So it's a little bit unsatisfactory. So what we've had to do, therefore, is to look for other corroborating evidence. Is there other evidence that we can see to supplement our literary evidence so that we can prove or disprove or corroborate this story? So there's two main classes of evidence that we might turn to at this point. We could turn to historical evidence and we can turn to archaeological evidence. So I'm going to take these each in turn and see how they do and do not support this theory of the Ionian migration. So going first of all to look at the historical supporting evidence. Now, if we think about it for 1 minute, if the Ionian cities are descended from Athens, if they were founded by Athenian colonists, we might expect to see similar cultural traits in the Ionian cities and in Athens. Things perhaps like kind of civic cults, festivals, months of the year, and organisation of kind of civic structures in the population might be similar in Ionia if they have inherited these from Athens originally. And I just want to have a look at one case of this. I want to look at civic organisation in the form of tribes. Now, tribes are the way the citizen body is divided up in a Greek city. And what we have in early Athens, so before the reforms of Cleisthenes in the 6th century, the pre-Cleisthenic tribes of Athens are these four here: the Geleontes, the Herpletes, the Agikores, and the Argedes. And what's quite interesting and quite nice is that we do have some of these tribes, evidence for some of these tribes existing in some of the Ionian cities. And I've got these for you up here highlighted in orange. So far, so good. This looks great. It looks like the Ionian cities could well have been founded by migrants from Athens, and they took their civic organisation to Ionia with them and established them in the cities. However, if we are really rigorous with looking at the actual evidence for this, it's not quite as rosy as we might initially think. So looking at Miletus, Miletus is perhaps the best example. Only 3 of the tribes are attested at Miletus itself through an inscription, the Molpoi inscription. Oh, actually, just to go back for 1 minute in this, the 4 original pre-Cleisthenic tribes of Athens, it is thought, were supplemented by 2 additional tribes, the Boreas and the Oinopes, when the migrants got to Ionia, probably to account for a more diverse population when they arrived, and so. So that's Miletus. It has 3. It has the 2 new ones, and it has 1 of the old ones. And that's all that's attested actually in Miletus. The other ones are attested in Milesian colonies, which is, it's good, but it's not quite the same thing as being actually attested on the ground at Miletus itself. Ephesus, we have more of a problem, because what we have attested by the historian Ephorus, writing in the 4th century, is that the 4 tribes are not actually tribes at Ephesus. They are actually subdivisions of tribes. They're chiliastes, they're subdivisions of the tribe of their physioi. So the picture is slightly more complicated. They're not straightforwardly taking the same civic structure from one place to another. But okay, let's give ourselves the benefit of the doubt here and carry on. If we look at Samos, we have got supposedly 3 of the Athenian tribes and the additional ones attested. But this is according not to evidence that we actually have, but according to the testimony of a 15th century travel writer, Syrio of Ancona, who says he saw an inscription. Now, we don't have this inscription, and we could trust him, but we're just not very sure about that. What we do know is that certainly by the 2nd century, we have these 2 tribes attested. So these are very completely different civic structures suggested by that evidence. If we kind of give everyone the benefit of the doubt and move on, we have got good epigraphic evidence for the tribe of the Geleontes at Teos. Fine. Okay, that one I'm not even going to touch. That's good. And then we also have it from Colophon too. Although actually Colophon, it looks like it might be a subdivision of a different tribe, but let's give it. Let's be kind of positive about this. Let's be optimistic. This then is the maximalist view of tribal similarities between Athens and Ionia. This is the best that we can kind of do, and that's great. But it's still a far cry from all the Ionian cities having all the same tribes as at Athens. If we were going to take a minimalist view, it might look something a little bit more like this, which is a lot less convincing. Now, there are other ways we could explain similarities in civic organisation between the Ionian cities and Athens as well, and that's deliberately choosing to make your tribes look the same as at Athens. And we certainly know that this is what happened at Priene before the 3rd century. They deliberately chose a tribal structure which looked like the post-Cleisthenic tribal structure of Athens. And in fact, we know that this happened at Miletus too, certainly by the 430s BC. They changed because the last 20 years they've had quite a lot of they'd had quite a lot of tense negotiations, relationships with Athens at this point, and they changed their tribal structure by the 430s to look a little bit like Athens. So we do know that this happens, therefore it puts the whole question of inheriting a tribal structure in a little bit of doubt. It doesn't mean that this didn't happen. It doesn't mean that the tribal structure were not inherited by the Ionian cities. It's certainly, the idea of an Ionian migration is certainly not disproved by this evidence at all. However, it's not proved either. This is not good enough, firm enough, solid enough proof to give our theory a good basis. It doesn't disprove it, okay? It's certainly consistent with it, but it's just not enough by itself. So therefore, let's have a look at a different class of evidence, see if we can get more evidence elsewhere. So if we look at the archaeology, second class of evidence, maybe there are things here that we can find which are stronger evidence for this theory. So the main evidence which we have from the archaeological record, which is used frequently to argue in favour of the Ionian migration, is the appearance of proto-geometric pottery in Anatolia. Now, proto-geometric pottery is, as I have put it up for you on the PowerPoint, it's pottery which is quite plain but has simple geometric designs in it. It is thought that it was developed in Athens, and it is thought that Athenian migrants take the style of proto-geometric pottery, bring it with them to Asia Minor, and this explains the appearance of this type of pottery in Anatolia. Here we have on the map just some kind of dots on the map. The black dots indicate where proto-geometric pottery has been found in the area around Ionia. Now, I haven't bothered to label the Ionian cities or Ionian settlements here because there just wasn't enough space on the map, to be honest. But I have labelled a number of other settlements which are not Ionian and yet also do have proto-geometric pottery. Some of these are Dorian Greek cities, okay, so Dermil, Asalik. Some of these are Aeolian Greek cities, places like Kyme. Some of these, however, are completely Anatolian indigenous communities, places like Mylassa, Çiğnetepecik, Sardis, Gordian. Now, Gordian's not quite in the right place. It's about as close as I got in this map. But no one would argue that these indigenous Anatolian communities were founded by Ionians simply because there's a little bit of proto-geometric pottery there. So if we won't make this argument for places like Sardis and Çiğnetepecik, it is questionable whether we should make these arguments in other cities like the Ionian Dodecapolis. So that's proto-geometric pottery. In addition, proto-geometric pottery, there are some questions as to where it originated in the first place. Some people have suggested that it emerged, first of all, in the northern Aegean, which would completely turn about this debate on its head. And there's a PhD currently ongoing at the University of Sheffield, which is suggesting that it actually emerges in Anatolia, which would completely turn everything on its head altogether. But we shall wait and see what that PhD actually says, because I'm not sure yet. So if that's proto-geometric pottery, what about other archaeological evidence? Now, I'm afraid this is not much more helpful. If we think about archaeological evidence for the actual foundation, the origins and the establishment of the cities, it certainly doesn't look like these cities were founded in the early Iron Age. If we have migrant Ionians arriving in the early Iron Age, they are arriving at cities, at settlements which are long established. Many of these sites have occupation layers which go back to the late, middle, sometimes early Bronze Age, and sometimes even further back than that. These are long established sites of settlement and occupation. They are not new foundations in the early Iron Age. That bit of it, the idea of new foundations, doesn't work. You could, of course, say that the Ionian migrants took over the sites and therefore refounded them anew, which might make some sense, but in a way that doesn't work completely either, because there is a long history at quite a few of these sites of intense interaction with the Aegean, with the Western and Southern Aegean in particular. Now, I've just put up for you a selection of various artifacts and installations from Miletus, from the Middle and Late Bronze Age levels of Miletus, which demonstrate a high level of interaction with Minoan Crete and then with Mycenaean Greece. We have here not just objects which are being traded to Miletus, but we have evidence that Minoan ways of doing things, Minoan cooking pots, Minoan ways of preparing food are kind of taking place in Miletus on the ground as well. We have Mycenaean ways of preparing pottery, of firing pottery. The two left-hand illustrations are pottery kilns. On the top right-hand corner, this is an example of Linear A. This is a Minoan script. We have Minoan ways of writing, Minoan know-how, Minoan technologies. So what we have at quite a few of these sites is not a situation where if the Ionian migrants were to come in the early Iron Age, they're coming to somewhere which is barbaric and unknown, where they would instead be arriving in a place which has generations of contact, interaction, and settlement, perhaps, by other Aegean peoples. So they're not arriving in this kind of totally alien otherworld. So that also is a kind of, it is not quite how it fits with the kind of textual model either. And finally, if we think about the textual model of Greek colonists coming and dominating the Anatolian locals, that's not quite necessarily what we see either. We do find evidence for continuing Anatolian practices, traditions, hybrid practices within these cities. Now, this is just an example. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, you have on your left some proto-geometric pottery from there, but you also have on your right typically Anatolian red and grey burnished wares with typical things like metal skeuomorphism and this rope and press decoration, absolutely characteristic indigenous Anatolian traits. And these things go alongside parallel. And far into historical period as well, we still have examples of local indigenous Anatolian languages, names still occurring at the Ionian cities. So it's not quite a black and white picture from that perspective either. So we've got a situation where none of the supporting evidence, either historical or archaeological, gives us a really good, firm grounding to prove the theory of Ionian migration. So what we're left with is a theory which we've kind of been put together, the story of the Ionian migration, which explains the origin of the Ionian cities, but without very good hard evidence for it. So that gives us two questions which need answering. Firstly, what are the texts doing? Okay, what are the texts saying if they're not just telling us the truth? Okay, why do the texts say this if they are basically wrong? That's the first question. And the second question is then, well, what was the origins of the Ionian cities? How did the Greeks come to be here, and what were they doing here anyway? So those are the next two things we've got to try and address. So firstly, why do these stories tell the myth in the first place? Now, what have I got here? Aha, right, let me not do that just yet. A lot of the all the textual sources are, of course, much, much later than the early Iron Age. They are at least 400 years later than the events that they purport to write about, at the very, very least. Some of them are much later than that. So they're not direct primary sources by any stretch of the imagination. So it's assumed that what they do is that they communicate an oral tradition, the outcome of an oral tradition. Stories of the Ionian migration were passed down through the centuries, and eventually they get written up in the texts. However, more recent interpretations of these stories and more recent approaches towards foundation myths take a more kind of literary approach. They take a kind of an instrumentalist or constructivist approach, whereby they say these texts don't necessarily just passively reflect an oral tradition which has been passed on. Perhaps what these texts are doing is more actively constructing kind of strategic arguments, agendas and biases of the authors are being communicated in these texts too. And it's not hard to see these at work within the stories of the Ionian migration. Now, there are four main kind of explanations people have given for why you might want to tell the story of the Ionian migration. And these certainly do work. Now, the first is Athenian propaganda, so to speak. It's quite obvious why. If you are an Athenian author, a pro-Athenian author, writing, you might want to write the story of the Ionian migration in the context of Athenian expansionism in the Eastern Mediterranean. It certainly justifies Athenian claims. It certainly gives Athens a better claim to its influence over the Ionian cities. Fantastic. You can see the strategic incentive for this. From the alternative perspective, you can also see the strategic incentive for the Ionian cities deliberately aligning themselves with Athens too. If the power of Athens is on the up, you can see why the Ionian cities might want to cozy up with Athens and say, actually, we're descended from you. That, you can understand that happening as well. Similarly, within Anatolia, the fact that the Ionians formed a very close-knit group also leads us to the third explanation. So the Ionians formed the Ionian League. It was an exclusive group. They didn't let anybody else join. The 12 cities of the League, then the 13, but nobody else than that. So the Aeolian Greeks were excluded, the Dorian Greeks were excluded, and quite a few other ethnically Ionian settlements were also excluded from the Ionian League. And what the story of the Ionian migration might do is it might give you a justification for why all those other guys can't be part of our club. If they're not part of our Ionian migration, they don't have this shared history, they cannot join our league. And you can certainly see that you can certainly see this myth being used in this way to exclude people within the region from this kind of very tight-knit club. And finally, even within individual cities, you could see an argument for why, if there are asymmetries of power between ethnic Greeks and ethnic Anatolians, you can see why these myths of the Ionian migration could have been used to justify those. Now, number 4 is the only one up here that I don't really agree with, but we can discuss that later for various reasons. But in any case, you can explain the text, you can explain the existence of this myth in many different literary kind of ways. So that's why these texts tell the myth. Fine. But where does that leave us with the second question? Question 2, where do these cities actually come from? Now, if we adopt this approach to the textual sources, the literary sources, the texts, we have to suggest the texts are useless for finding out where the myths actually came from. If all the texts do tell you about the time is to tell you about the time they were written in, rather than the time they were written about, then they can't tell us anything about the early Iron Age. So the argument goes. However, I do think you can get something out of these texts about the early Iron Age, and we can get something from this literary material about where these cities came from, what is the origin of the Ionian cities, and what were the Greeks doing here, how did they come to be here in the first place. But in order to do that, we need to adopt quite a radically different approach to the way we are reading these texts. Crucially, what we cannot do is simply read them. Okay? We should not be interested in the details and the nuances of individual stories and individual texts. As I mentioned before, there are lots of relevant texts. Okay? Again, you cannot read, if you'd like lists of these later, just let me know and I'm very happy to email them around. I have not included everything in my files. I've got one file which I didn't manage to get to write up in time for this lecture. So there's about kind of 30 other things to go on here. But there's a lot of texts, and I've mentioned these before. Some of these tell the whole story. Some of these tell part of the story. Some of these only make passing references to various characters or events within the Ionian migration. But none of them tell the full tale in all the bits which we understand to be the Ionian migration now. Now, if we have a look at the black list, the list in black, these are texts which talk about the origins of the Ionian cities in terms of the Ionian migration. Now, if you have a look at the list in dark blue, these are the texts which talk about the origins of the Ionian cities in other terms. Not in terms of the Ionian migration, but in terms perhaps of migrations from other places, from Crete, from Messenia, from Thessaly, from Boeotia, from Phoenicia, okay? Or perhaps they talk about the origins of the cities in terms of indigenous foundations. So that is quite interesting. We have a much messier picture here, a much more diverse picture than one theory might suggest. So I started off by talking about the explanation for the origin of the Ionian cities, the story, the theory. We don't have one. It is not singular. If there's one thing we should learn from the literary evidence, there is no singular explanation to be sought. What we should perhaps be doing instead is looking at this plurality of different explanations, is looking at the diversity. Now, the approach which I would advocate we take to something quite as confusing and messy and as diverse as this is thinking about it a bit like an archaeological assemblage. Looking at all of them, looking at groups of things rather than any one individual thing. And this is where I think there are methodological approaches which ancient historians can usefully steal from archaeologists here. Now, if we were to, just as a thought exercise, adopt this approach of a textual assemblage to these stories, what would we find out about the origins of the Ionian cities? Now, again, these are not complete lists because I haven't quite finished going through my files, and I'm sure I've missed things out. So if anyone notices something obvious that I've missed out, please do let me know. That would be fantastic. But if we did start to analyse these in terms of an assemblage, what would it look like? Now, we've got 97 that we're looking at in total here. The first thing we should obviously note is that stories which explain the origins of the Ionian cities with reference to the Ionian migration, 35 of them. They're clearly the largest single group of stories. Fantastic. However, they are by no means in the majority. There are a lot of stories out there which talk about migration from other places as an explanation for the origins of cities, and there are a lot of stories, 26, which talk about indigenous foundation of these cities too. Now, you can dispute my division into different headings. You could certainly kind of divide things up in a slightly different way, but this is just to kind of get us thinking along these lines. This is very crude. I'm sorry, I'm not a mathematician or a statistician, but it's extremely crude, horrible colour schemes which have come straight out of the Excel paint block. But you can kind of just see that, yes, stories of the Ionian migration make up a very significant proportion, but they are by no means dominant. They are simply part of the wider discourse. Now, that's interesting. Another way that we could cut this up is by thinking about this chronologically. So if we were to divide up the authors by the times in which they were writing, do we find patterns in the kinds of stories that are told at different periods within classical antiquity? And funnily enough, again, very crude, awful Excel spreadsheets, I apologise again, we do find some patterns. What's interesting, stories of the Ionian migration don't figure amongst our earliest texts. So our very early texts within the 8th and 7th centuries tell other stories. They don't seem to tell about the Ionian migration. The Ionian migration stories only appear in the 6th century, according to later scholars, at the very earliest. But they don't, at this point, they're still not the most popular type of story. It's not until later on, 4th and 3rd century, that they become popular, and it's not until the 2nd and 1st centuries BC when they really become dominant in the discourse. Now, I think that's quite interesting, and I can't think of any, I haven't kind of got my head around why it's the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC that suddenly this story takes hold and becomes so dominant, but it certainly seems to be a chronological pattern in there. So this is something which perhaps needs explanation, needs further investigation. That's chronological. What about if we were to divide them up by genre? Now, again, these are not brilliant categorizations. We could certainly dispute why I've put certain things in local history and certain things and why I put universal geography and universal history together, but you can see certain patterns, and thinking in this way helps you to see certain patterns, even if you do want to change the divisions around. For example, Ionian migration stories seem to be by far and away the most popular thing within universal history or universal geography writing. There seems to be, if you are writing a pan-Mediterranean history or geography, talking about the origins of the Ionian cities in terms of the Ionian migration seems to be the kind of thing that you would do. However, they are much less popular in local history writing and in public performance. Now, what I mean by public performance are things like speeches, things which are very much rooted in a particular place and a particular time. So again, locally focused pieces of literature. And what's interesting is that in locally focused pieces of literature, so local history and public performance pieces, we have this interest in other migrations from a diverse set of places, rather than in the Ionian migration, which is quite interesting. Now, niche here is niche bits is like kind of scientific treatises and kind of philosophical texts and things like that. And it's, again, I'm not sure why, but Ionian migration stories seem to feature very strongly in those. And of course, in encyclopedia and compendia, you get everything, because that's what encyclopedias do, of course. So again, these may not be perfect. I don't think these numbers are final by any stretch of the imagination, but there are patterns, and I think it's useful to be thinking in terms of these patterns. Now, the last category, the last kind of way of division that I'd want to have a quick look at before I wrap up is by where the authors come from, the place of origins of the authors. And this does seem to impact on the stories that they choose to tell as well. So, unsurprisingly, if you come from the Western Aegean, you are more inclined to tell stories about the Ionian migration than other accounts of the origins of the Ionian cities. If you come from the Eastern Aegean, so if you come from Asia Minor or the surrounding islands, you tend not to tell stories of the Ionian migration quite so much, but you might tell, interestingly, stories of other migration. That's quite interesting. So there are just some interesting patterns to be seen here. Now, again, I don't want to rest too much on absolute patterns or absolute numbers, and there's a lot of problems with the material, absolutely, but I think the approach and the way of looking at this material does throw up some interesting new insights and some interesting new questions as well as insights. So what it does is it focuses not on any individual story, any individual account, but it encourages us to think in terms of the diversity, the plurality of different stories, different origins, different ideas about origins which were out there. What we're looking at is not any foundation myth. We are looking at a foundation discourse. We're looking at a variety of different stories bouncing off one each other, running parallel, all at the same time, with rises in popularities at different times for different reasons. So what do these texts then? What does it do for us? If we look at the text as a discourse, we look at the text as an assemblage, what does this do for our question about the origin of the Ionian cities? What does it say about where the cities, why the Greeks are here in the first place? Now, I think if you look at the text in all their glorious, messy, chaotic diversity, what you get is a picture which talks not of any single migration in one direction at one time, with one leader, with one group. You get a sense of much more kind of mobility rather than migration. You have migrations happening, mobility happening in different directions, involving different groups of people from various parts of the Greek world, from various parts of the Near Eastern world, within Anatolia itself, people moving around. And it's out of this much more kind of messy picture that we get the emergence of the Ionian cities, not the absolute foundation in any one moment in time, not a single origin, but a diversity of origins and a slow, gradual emergence. And I think this is perhaps our answer to our question. The Ionian cities are not founded at any one moment. They don't have one point of origin. What they do is they emerge out of the kind of the chaos and the instability and the general mobility and fluidity, which is the early Iron Age. Not only do they emerge as cities, but they emerge in terms of their identities as well. They become Ionian not overnight. They become Ionian because they start to see themselves as Ionian. And this must be a process of coming together. It's a long, slow process, but it must crystallize at a particular moment in time. Now, as I said at the beginning, the Ionian cities are extremely influential in establishing, giving us a lot of what we think of as typical Greek culture. What the Ionian cities are clearly doing before they get to this stage is they're experimenting culturally for several centuries until the beginning of the Archaic period. And this is where I'm going to gallop off into surmise and supposition here, is that I would imagine, and this is what I think, the Ionian cities, their identity, they become Ionian. The becoming of the Ionians happens perhaps in the century or so before the beginning of the Archaic period. It's a process which involves a lot of cultural experimentation, a lot of cultural playing around with Greek ideas, with Near Eastern ideas, but something must crystallize it to make it kind of click, to make them become the Ionian League and make them Ionian. Now, I don't know what that is yet, but that will be, hopefully, my next research project. And if I'm here, if anybody hears me speaking in the next kind of 4 or 5 years' time, maybe I'll have an answer for you by then. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Nisha, for a marvellous talk. And I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience to provoke you to further speculation. Please.
Thank you very much. I wonder how you see the role of dialect in the emergence of these cities. Ionian versus Aeolic and Doric and so on.
I think, I am by no means a linguistic specialist, but I would view language and dialect to be similar to many other cultural forms in that it's something which does not necessarily reflect what your identity is, but it's something that helps you to construct it. Now, we hear that there are dialectical differences within the Ionian cities, that some of them are kind of a Lydian influence, a Mycarian influence, and Erythrae does its own kind of slightly different dialect as well. But there is a point at which I guess people choose it to be important or choose it not to be important. I think it's something which you don't choose your dialect, is not what I'm trying to say, but you choose whether it's significant within your ethnicity or not, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Some questions over here, and I think I've seen another hand on the far side.
Thank you for a marvellous talk. Can I just ask you one thing? If people are moving eastwards, say, from Attica, wherever, in view of that marvellous fruit salad of places on the map, do you suspect there was a guiding force that sent people to one place or another, or was it somewhat random? Do you suspect certain family linkages? Do you suspect certain trade routes, why some guy ends up on Chios rather than Samos, or whatever? Do you suspect, however unprovably at this point, that there were factors guiding people?
I suspect there were. I think if I'm being very fixed about hard evidence, we don't have hard evidence here. All we can surmise is random Brownian motion of people going all over places and they end up in the patterns. What I suspect is that there is a lure to this part of Western Anatolia. We get a sense that towards when the Hittite Empire is kind of crumbling into different bits, we know that there is a strong central political authority within the Cayster River Valley, which is the kingdom of Mira. And David Hawkins has kind of published about the Carabel inscriptions. We know there was a centralized political authority there. We don't know very much about the history of that kingdom, but it could be that in a time of instability, we have a kind of not an island of political stability, but perhaps an area here which is slightly more stable than some of the surrounding regions, and it might be understandable that under those circumstances you might be inclined to head there, perhaps if it's a land of opportunity. But that's complete surmise, that is supposition.
A couple more on this side, I think.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wish I'd caught the beginning of it. I almost want to ask a separate question now based on this gentleman's, but I'll go with my original one. Basically, you talked about the very end of your talk. I was wondering, do you think it was the formation of an aristocracy in the growing polis, if you like, in the 8th and 7th centuries that sort of led to polis identities that gave rise to these calling themselves Ionian cities as opposed to just being Anatolian cities and Doric cities or the rest of it. If that makes sense. I kind of have a tendency to ramble.
Again, I'm going to go with lots of surmise here. I'm not an expert in the early Greek polis by any stretch of the imagination. I would expect that the kinds of things which hold different city-states together would be interpolis ties. And the kind of way you get interpolis ties are by family connections, groups which intermarry, and if you have a sense of commonality, it's perhaps held together by kind of groups which have a common interest, which share across these groups. We certainly know that the Ionian cities do, aristocrats within the Ionian cities do intermarry within each other. They also intermarry with the Lydian royal family too, but that is certainly one way of holding together alliances and that we know that happens. Whether it's absolutely instrumental in the emergence of an Ionian conscious identity, I don't know, but it could be.
Another question in the front.
Yes, thank you very much. We haven't talked very much about population itself, and I was wondering whether you expect the new biological methods of studying ancient human remains, to show any light on possible migration patterns. DNA testing of.
It would be wonderful if they could. We don't have a lot of cemetery data from Ionia. I know there's going to be a new project at Colophon which is going to start looking at the cemeteries there, but we haven't had good enough archaeological data where we can extract that kind of DNA evidence so that we could do that work yet. It would be wonderful if we did. Maybe in the future.
Any more questions? Yes.
Just to follow on from several points I think you made and also earlier questioners. I remember, I think it was in the 1960s, by whom I can't remember, one theory put forward was that certain components of certain migrants were actually remnants of from Pylos and other Mycenaean cultures, which seems to be logical, because there's yet another migration. The Dorian one is another thing, subject to tendentious literature. But it was the name Naoise particularly that was mentioned. If it goes back to a Mycenaean form, Nehelawos, that it's based on a stem, nes, nehe, meaning to lead, which was the same one used by Nestor of Pylos, and there is some elements in the legendary accounts which makes the hook to Athens rather artificial. And it does suggest, as you have said, that there were people from all over, and it's only retrospective propaganda that Athens becomes the focus of this. And that's one possible source. And of course, if you think of things like the Bellerophon legend and other indications of the Trans-Aegean links between Mycenaean cultures and Anatolia, then if confronted with invaders, a lot of people would go to where they felt there was another home waiting for them. Whether or not Mira was stable or possibly unstable, and therefore they could make their way, is part of the question. I don't have a question.
No, but that's certainly true with the Messenian link, the Pylian link, and it's often been kind of crowbarred into the story that actually what we have is, if we talk about Ionians coming to Ionia from Messenia, what we actually have is people getting confused, because what the Messenians did is they went from Pylos to Athens, then from Athens, and so if you talk about a direct line of migration, it must be that they got confused and their wires crossed. So we have a tendency to kind of make the sources fit into one narrative, when actually, why are we so unhappy with the idea of people coming directly from Messenia? Why not?
One more, I promise. I got a list, but what is it about Ionia that drew people there? Is it mineral wealth? Is it land hunger? Because I mean, later on there is the talk of in the 8th century there's the search for apokia, isn't there, or emporion? I just wonder, what was it that drew them there? Because Hesiod talks about leaving this, I can't remember his exact words, but poor land and rubbish weather, rubbish land, and all the rest of it, and moving back to Boeotia. So I just wonder what it was that drew them there.
I suppose if we can't necessarily tell about what the push factors were for anyone to leave, but I think you can say there are some very clear pull factors. There is some fantastic land here. There's some fantastic fertile land. There are some fantastic positions in terms of routes, right? Those routes up and down these long east-west river valleys and kind of north and south, going kind of up from the Mediterranean up into the Black Sea. So these are very well-positioned places, often excellent harbours as well, and kind of land and sea both. And also, trade, I suppose, and also the kind of agricultural wealth of the land. But apart from that, I don't know, why anywhere else, I suppose? I mean, if we're thinking about it, the early Iron Age as a time when people are going to a lot of different locations, and there are a lot of places being founded. These are not the only places being founded at the time, or these are not the only places being settled, and that people are settling down at the time. People are settling elsewhere. We're just discussing them at the moment. Does that make sense?
One in the middle at the back.
This is a rather way-out question, but when thinking of how the ideas of the Ionian colonization might have got distorted over time, did you think of comparing it with other colonization experiences in other places? I mean, if you think about the way in which the inhabitants of New England regard the Pilgrim Fathers, they have concentrated all their founding myth on the Pilgrim Fathers, whereas the actual historical record shows that it's far more widely spread and that the Pilgrim Fathers played only a very small part in the story.
suppose in direct answer to the question, no, I hadn't thought of doing that, but that's a very interesting comparison to make, and I'm sure you could make many other comparisons to different parts of the world as well. What's interesting is that what the Ionian authors do, and actually if you look at authors who are from Ionia or the Eastern Aegean, is they tend to write of a more diverse set of origins. So it seems like they tend to want to think of themselves as having diverse origins rather than having singular origins. So even if they did have singular origins, we'd still have to explain why they preferred to write in terms of diverse origins, which in itself would be an interesting phenomenon.
Do have one more there.
Can you? Yes, I don't think. I hope this isn't a tangent. And your question about the founding myth of the Pilgrim Fathers stimulated my thoughts. These stories and traditions of these Ionian colonies, do they continue in the memory of at the time when these colonies become under Achaemenid rule, and later under the Romans and the Byzantines? I mean, is there any evidence that they think of them at all, or are they lost by then?
No, in fact, these are when the stories become even more popular.
I wondered, yes, that I would think so. Yes, we're under the Achaemenid rule, Persian rule, which by all accounts was not unreasonable. But what about our great past? That would make sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, so what's interesting is that immediately when they're under Achaemenid rule, they start to talk about lots of different origins.
Yes.
And I think, as I showed earlier in one of the slides, in a very, very bad graph, I'm sorry, that it's actually it's in the Roman period when they start getting really excited about the whole idea of the Ionian migration, which I'm not quite sure why it would be under Roman rule that would be the case, but there's an explanation. You need to search for the explanation for that somewhere.
It is interesting. The survival stories are of great significance. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we. Yes, no, surely we've got time for one more question.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. Just as not a very well-informed question, but is there any religious connection? Would it be that there was a god, or that was a charismatic individuals, or that sort of said, "Come with me and follow me. I'm going to set up a new state somewhere," or would it be that they said, "Well, they're not allowed"? Perhaps there was a religious conflict; they weren't allowed to worship that particular religion where they were, and so they decided to go somewhere else and do it. Or is it too early for that? I don't know.
Now, there's been quite a lot of work being done very recently about religious contacts between the Aegean and Anatolia in the late Bronze Age, and there seems to be a lot more religious kind of similarities across this region than we might have previously thought. So Ian Rutherford and Alice Mouton are doing quite a lot of exciting things on that. I don't think we can tell at this stage whether that would have been a spur for more movement. Now, traditionally, of course, within the traditional classical tradition, the oracle at Delphi tells you, go and found the city, go and found that city. And there is a reference in one of the Scholias, so much, much later text, in which Neleus is told to go to Ionia and cast out the unjust, the adikoi Carians. But this is a much, much, much later kind of Byzantine text, which doesn't reflect necessarily earlier traditions. But that doesn't seem to be the case in most of the other texts that we have. It's not a kind of common theme that we have running through them. What we do have instead is stories of the founders founding new cults when they do found the city. So Neleus, when he gets to Miletus, is supposed to have founded a cult to Artemis, and Manto, when she gets to Colophon, founds the oracular sanctuary of Apollo. So founding a new cult seems to be a feature, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be a feature of why you might leave, if that makes sense.
Could I ask about the Ionian League? Most of the leagues are in the 2nd, 3rd century BC. How do you date the Ionian League?
Well, we are told by Herodotus that the League meets at the Pan-Ionian when the Persians where the Persians are threatening them, and the Ionians get together at their meeting place and debate what they should do. Should they join together against the Persian foe? And they decide, we'll all do our own thing, and some of them do this and some of them do that, and they're very dispersed league. They're around for centuries, and it seems to be very symbolically significant, but they're not very good at actually doing stuff together. They seem to fight amongst themselves a lot more than actually get together and do things. So that we certainly have them.
Right, I think we'd better draw the questions to an end so that everybody has time for a drink before they go. I'm burning to ask a question myself, but I shall frame it in a sentence of summing up before we go for a drink, and then Naoise can talk about it afterwards. And that's just how her lecture has shown the way that our understanding of the Ionians, and the Ionians as a particularly good example, is particularly shaped by, as it were, modern perspectives on it. There is a standard received view of who the Ionians were and where they came from, and this is embedded in our literature, which we read in universities and we read in textbooks and so forth, and that literature, in fact, is not a given, but is a construction and a well-established scholarly construction. And I myself was doing some very, very superficial work on this area, just sort of quickly reading up on the background to Greeks in Western Anatolia, and I was very struck by, if you look at the bit in the north, the Aeolians, or the bit in the south, the Dorians, and you read the standard modern encyclopedia on this subject, which is a magnificent work called the Copenhagen Polis Project, with huge entries on it. Every time the author, or the authors, because they're not the same person, are confronted with these cities, communities, not ones shown on the map, but the ones to the north and the south, they sort of say, oh, we can't tell whether they're Greek or native. And they step back and they won't make a decision, maybe Greek, maybe Anatolian, maybe some sort of inexplicable mixture. When it comes to Ionia, they're absolutely confident they're Greek, obviously, because that's what the story tells them they must be. But Naoise's talk has shown that there's at least a third of the tradition tells you that they're indigenous. And so these sort of certainties about who is Greek and why, and for what reason and where, suddenly melt into interesting obscurity. Thank you very much indeed for a splendid lecture, and let us hope everybody please applaud, and then let's have a